one firm point of agreement. There is one. Is it all right? Yes? Now it's better. There is today one firm point of agreement between Ukrainians and Russians. History matters. But Russia has turned history into a weapon. This is not an example for Ukraine to follow. Ukraine can distinguish itself in historical discussions by being scrupulous about fact and recognizing the legitimacy of disagreement about the most controversial questions we all face. The agreements that defined the post-Second World War system disproportionately reflected the weight of the Soviet Union's contribution in defeating Nazi Germany. They did not properly reflect the Allied contribution in sustaining the Soviet Union's survival during those years, and they entirely ignored the fact that the Soviet Union connived with Nazi Germany to begin that war in the first place and dismember, dismantle, and annex the states between them. Until the West established the means to contain the expansion of the Soviet Union and defeat its proxies in Western Europe, the demarcation lines of Potsdam were for Stalin provisional, and they did not discourage him from seeking control of all of Germany and a dominant position in all of Western Europe. Only after the formation of NATO, the European coal and steel community, and the success of the Marshall Plan and recovery of Western Europe did the Soviet Union begin to treat the Potsdam demarcation lines as fixed, permanent, and sacrosanct. But for Ukraine, the post-war system denied it any juridical existence. And amongst other consequences, this meant that for a further 50 years, there was complete ignorance elsewhere about the disproportionate role played in defeating Nazi Germany by Ukrainians, and for that matter, Belarusians, and the disproportionate burdens and sacrifices made by ordinary Ukrainians at home, and Belarusians too. In 1944 alone, the retreating German armies burnt 300 Belarusian villages to the ground, and there are similar horrifying statistics that define Ukraine's historical memory and reality of that time, and to this day, very little of this is understood. To this day, there is a misplaced, warped, and misshapen sense of responsibility to Russia as the contributor to all of these, to this victory and its share of the burdens. The Helsinki Final Act, 30 years later, was another momentous episode, and it is extremely important. It has left a very powerful legacy which is with us to this moment. It was, as you know, the outcome of the long-running Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the predecessor to the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. For Moscow, the Helsinki Final Act represented conclusive recognition by the West of the political and ideological status quo in Europe. In practice, that agreement did nothing of the kind. It was very carefully negotiated by the West, and the only thing that agreement did was to recognize the territorial status quo in Europe, and what is more, ensure and reinstate the fundamental principles of the UN Charter and their applicability to the states of the then Warsaw Pact. And that fact, and the conclusions drawn from that fact, in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and elsewhere, opened the pores in what up until then had been a hermetically sealed system, and in this way began to erode the foundations of Soviet control. Ukraine, the events that later led to the re-emergence of Ukraine did not begin in Ukraine. They began in Central Europe, primarily in Poland, but the implications were immediately grasped by Ukrainian patriots who by the mid-1980s had become a source of enormous worry to Mikhail Gorbachev and the Soviet regime, which reached uncontrollable proportions after its attempt to conceal the real magnitude of the Chernobyl catastrophe. And now I come to the post-Cold War settlement. The post-Cold War settlement extended the Helsinki principles to all the former Soviet states. And it is for this reason that the Western powers, including Britain, concluded that the Cold War was over. And there was a second reason. First, the Soviet Union under Gorbachev, and later the Russian Federation under Boris Yeltsin co-authored these agreements. These agreements did not emerge as a form of diktat. They were very elaborately and carefully negotiated in a very consensual and friendly atmosphere. Why Boris Yeltsin negotiated these agreements, why they agreed to accept that Ukraine and other countries should enjoy independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, freedom of choice, and equality, juridical equality with Russia, is a subject of another discussion, which I do not have time to touch upon. But they did so. What needs to be said, and this is my penultimate point before concluding, is that even before Russia attacked Georgia in 2008, Vladimir Putin and the elite that consolidated his position, in fact an elite that was becoming more and more strong and central to Russian policy making even in the mid-1990s, were already attacking this settlement and questioning its legitimacy. In 2014, Russia's attack on the foundations of the Cold War order became brazen and explicit. Russia today does not conceal from anyone the fact that it regards the post-Cold War system, which it co-authored, as illegitimate, inimical to its interests, and intrinsically vulnerable. My final point. What in Russia's view should replace it? Well, Sergei Narishkin, who has now gone back to his roots and is now in charge of the Служба внешней разведки, the Foreign Intelligence Service, stated in 2014, when he was chairman of the Gosduma, the West has a choice, either to relearn the lessons of Yalta or face war. So that is one aspect of it, but there is another aspect which Ukrainians understand better than we do, and it is very important. It is the civilizational aspect. Vladimir Putin in 2011 wrote an article in which he said, "The choice of the Russian people has not been made by referenda and plebiscites, it has been defined by blood." He did not mean what Nazis meant by blood. What he meant was, it is culturally and historically predetermined, and when he referred to the Russian people, he did not simply mean Ruski люди, he meant Russian, Ruski mir, and he meant you. He meant Ukrainians as well, and you have nothing to say about it. Ukrainians may think they're part of Europe, they may wish to be part of Europe, but culturally and historically, from a Russian perspective, which is deeply subscribed to even by Russian liberals and critics of Putin, Ukraine simply does not have the capacity. It lacks the cultural constituents to become part of Europe, and it is as absurd for Ukraine to wish to be part of Europe and the EU as it is for me, James Sherr, to become Japanese, because I wish to become it. And these views are very deep. For Russia, the problem is this, that the historical West, which it defines basically as the Holy Roman Empire plus, with which Russia has no quarrel, is one thing. But the political and legal West today is something else, because the political West today extends across the gray zone that separates the historical West from Ruski Mir. And that for Russia is the principal source of tension in Europe. I will conclude simply by saying the challenge for Ukraine today is not simply to defend itself, not simply to prevail in the war and the current conflict, but to demonstrate both to the West and in the end to Russia that Ukraine is not part of Russia's cultural and historical bloodline, but that Ukraine is Ukraine, and that the war that Russia started in eastern Ukraine has made it more Ukrainian than it was before. Дякую.